Buongiorno a tutti. Questa è la prima Alan Krueger lecture, il grande economista che era stato ben 7 volte al Festival dell'Economia di Trento, presentando sempre dei lavori su temi di grandissima rilevanza pratica e politica, sui temi di cui discutiamo in questi giorni. Aveva parlato delle questioni legate al salario minimo, del suo impatto sul lavoro, sul mercato del lavoro, dei problemi dell'immigrazione, dei problemi dell'istruzione, della dimensione giusta delle classi, per esempio, per insegnare meglio, per massimizzare i risultati dell'istruzione. Più recentemente si era dedicato ai problemi dei lavoratori cosiddetti gig workers, dell'economia dei lavoretti, di come assicurare loro protezione. Il suo ultimo lavoro è un libro che viene qui oggi anche presentato, che era sulla economia del rock. Questo univa la sua grande passione per la musica, è un libro davvero in cui Alan mostra una cultura musicale straordinaria e assieme a questa utilizza tutti gli strumenti dell'economia, per cui è un racconto dell'industria della musica in cui uno impara tantissime cose di economia. E devo dire che forse una ragione in più, oltre alla sua grande passione per la musica che l'ha spinto a occuparsi di un tema come quello dell'industria della musica e del rock, è il fatto che in quell'ambito c'è maggiore mobilità sociale. Come lui stesso scrive, nel 1976 il 15% dei musicisti della Billboard Top 100 proveniva da famiglie collocate nel 10% più povero della popolazione. Nel 2016 questa percentuale era salita al 26,5%, grazie soprattutto al successo della musica hip hop rap. Purtroppo per gli altri americani la mobilità sociale, questo lui sottolineava, è molto più limitata. Solo il 2% di chi proviene dal 10% più povero riesce a raggiungere da adulto l'1% più ricco. Quindi i temi distributivi, le questioni anche legate alle opportunità, all'uguaglianza delle opportunità sono sempre state al centro dei lavori di Alan Krueger. Alan Krueger era stato uno degli economisti, per certi aspetti è stato per noi come un moderno Keynes, perché è stato un economista che è sempre stato in grado di dialogare direttamente con persone che avevano grandi responsabilità politiche. Sappiamo il suo ruolo come a capo dei consiglieri economici di Obama, e proprio qui al festival in una occasione si era proprio soffermato sui difficili rapporti tra economisti e politici e sulle difficoltà che ci sono in queste interazioni, perché spesso i politici fanno fatica a accettare il terreno di riflessione, di analisi dei politici, spesso cedono a delle metafore che sono fuorvianti, talvolta lo fanno di proposito, in altri casi lo fanno perché non hanno gli strumenti per comprendere una scienza comunque complessa come l'economia. E quello che lui ci ha sempre detto, e credo che sia la lezione principale che noi possiamo trarre dai suoi lavori, è che è fondamentale sempre istruire questi dialoghi con informazioni, con dati. L'economista, questo anche lo scrive nel suo ultimo lavoro, deve essere umile, deve cercare di presentare i dati, l'evidenza empirica. E proprio nei suoi rapporti con Obama, lui aveva 5 minuti per presentare le sue riflessioni sulle questioni più importanti che vengono poste alla sua attenzione. Nel 95% dei casi lui riusciva a trovare dei dati e avrebbe potuto anche, se chiaramente successivamente, attuare delle sperimentazioni randomizzate. Negli altri casi comunque era possibile raccogliere delle informazioni, quindi su quasi tutti i temi è possibile avere delle evidenze empiriche con cui istruire il dialogo con i politici. E quindi la sua grande lezione è proprio quella di cercare sempre di dare fondamento empirico, dati, far parlare i dati nel dialogo con chi deve prendere delle decisioni. E quindi abbiamo voluto in questa edizione del festival, a partire da questa edizione del festival, ricordare Alan Krueger con queste lezioni che saranno tutte proprio su scelte di politica economica rilevanti che siano fondate sull'evidenza empirica. Questo è il modo con cui noi riteniamo più importante ricordare Alan Krueger, e siamo lieti di dire che oggi avremo Hilari, su cui dirò fra breve qualcosa, avremo altre persone che hanno proprio dedicato la loro carriera a studiare i dati e a far parlare i dati per le scelte di politica economica. Gli altri economisti che hanno accettato di tenere le prossime Alan Krueger Lecture in prossime lezioni del festival sono Josh Angrist, sono David Card, sono Larry Katz ed Enrico Moretti, che sono tutti studiosi che hanno lavorato con Alan Krueger e che hanno anche loro ispirato la loro carriera a questa volontà di lavorare su dati e su riscontri empirici. Sono economisti applicati che hanno applicato proprio questo principio dell'evidence-based economic policy. Hilari HOYNES ha una chair in Economic Disparities all'Università di Berkeley, ha studiato tutti i principali programmi di contrasto alla povertà negli Stati Uniti, dai food stamps all'Earned Income Tax Credits, ai Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, e oggi è qui per parlare dei problemi delle politiche di contrasto alla povertà basati su redditi universali di base, e in questo contesto ci parlerà anche, raccolto informazioni su questa cosa con grande attenzione, della sin qui parziale, perché chiaramente siamo nei primi mesi di attuazione, misura del reddito di cittadinanza nel nostro paese. Hilari HOYNES è un economista di fama internazionale, ha pubblicazioni sulle migliori riviste economiche, sui top journals degli economisti, e chiaramente quindi può darci una prospettiva molto approfondita su questi aspetti, e siamo quindi molto lieti di inaugurare questa serie di lecture dedicate ad Alan Krueger proprio con la sua presentazione. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tito. It's lovely to be here, and it's quite an honor to be giving the first Alan Krueger lecture. To start on a small personal note, I'm not a student of Alan's, nor was I his colleague at Princeton or in Washington, D.C. policy circles. Yet, nonetheless, Alan Krueger has had a profound impact on my career as an applied economist. And I would posit that if we polled a random sample of applied economists working around the world, you would get a very similar answer. And Alan's influence in sort of, in some ways, revolutionizing applied empirical economics has had a profound impact on so many of us. I myself got my PhD in 1992, and it was just at this time that Alan and his colleagues, including my colleague David Card, were starting to work on these issues and sort of moving away from a sort of purely theoretical frame to really advancing the combination of data and policy variation, what we call natural experiments or quasi-experimental variation, in order to study the most important issues of the time, which then in the early 1990s were issues around immigration, minimum wages, issues that are still highly relevant today. So again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about universal basic income generally and the new guaranteed minimum income program here in Italy. So if you don't mind, I'm going to stand up. I can't possibly give a talk sitting down. It's not possible. So I'm going to stand up, and hopefully the mic will work well enough in the room. told it's on. Oh, there we go. Now it's on. Okay. So if you could put the slides up. So I'm going to start by talking generally about something that many people are terming universal basic income. And just to sort of start out, there's massive interest in Europe, in the United States, in North America, around the world, in issues around universal basic income. And you can see there's many different contexts in which the term basic income or universal basic income is coming out. In the last year, there have been more than a half a dozen books coming out that are addressing and talking about this issue of universal basic income. If you look at citations in the New York Times, the top newspaper in the United States, you can see this tremendous increase in the number of references to the term, and just by comparison also including basic income, which many people use sort of in the same sort of context. If you just look at Google searches and compare Google searches for universal basic income compared to a sort of related term that we're going to talk about called the negative income tax, all of these things are just showing other measures of tremendous interest and a lot of talking about universal basic income. But, and of course, here in Italy, many are characterizing the new citizens' income as a new, quote, basic income for Italy. And so what I'm going to do is talk for a bit about more kind of generally about what a universal basic income is, what kinds of problems it's meant to try to solve, and then sort of transition near the end to come back to the Italian context, talk about citizens' income, and then we'll have some time in the Q&A maybe to talk about that further. But what I've noticed, and my colleagues who sort of study the social safety net have noticed, in all this discussion about universal basic income, is a sort of lack of precision about, one, what it is and what it is not. Number two, what economic problem is it meant to be solving? Is it the right problem, the right solution to this problem? And so what I want to sort of, and then finally also, what are the questions that we need to know in order to evaluate whether universal basic income might in fact be a good solution to those problems. So that's really what I want to talk about today. And so it's always good to start at the beginning. I teach both economics and public policy, and one of the things that we teach our public policy students is step one is always define the problem. So don't work down to solution space until you first characterize what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And so part one here is to say, among advanced countries around the world, what is the problem that is leading to people talking about universal basic income? So one possible problem might be the finding that we're really seeing a kind of secular trend down in labor force or employment rates, particularly for men across the world. This gives you some data for the United States. But if you look out to the OECD more broadly, and this is showing underemployment, not just employment. So what you can see is that the black diamonds are showing the share of people who were underemployed in 2006, and the blue bar gives you the most recent number, approximately 2017. And you can see that Italy has experienced the largest amount of underemployment and a great rise since before the crisis. Between 2006 and 2017, you can see the OECD average also increasing, and you can see a lot of variation across areas. So one problem is concerns about underemployment. Another problem that may be related to this is the sort of looking forward and the concerns about the robots are coming to take our jobs. And so that's a more prospective, forward-looking problem that many people are talking about. Another related issue to underemployment is stagnation of wages. So again, starting with the United States, and this is plotting wages in inflation-adjusted terms relative to their value at the beginning of the period, which here is 1980. And this is plotting this for all workers by education level. And what you can see here is for the lower education levels, not completing high school, having a less than a college degree, you see very little improvement in wages over this many-decade period expressed in this graph. So we have consistent sort of concerns about stagnating wages, or more generally, rising inequality. So this graph from recent work by Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman shows that taking into account both earned income, social safety net income, capital income, a broad measure of income and public goods from the government, what you can see is that the share of national income in the United States going to the top 1% of the population has almost exactly gone up by the amount of income that is going to the bottom half of the distribution. So the United States is clearly a place with dramatic and rising inequality, but that rising inequality is not just characterized by the United States. So this graph from a recent paper from the World Inequality Database, an excellent resource for anyone interested in inequality, characterizes the top 10% of income holders in each country and the share of income held by that top 10%, and compares it in 1980 to a later period here in 2017. And every dot on this graph represents a different country, and we've got Italy here sort of in the middle of the pack. And you can see that essentially all of these countries are above the 45-degree line, saying that inequality is higher in 2017 than it is in 1980. So inequality, or the amount of income that is held by the top 10% of the population, is rising. If we zero in a little bit more just on the Southern European countries, you can see that this same measure, the top 10% of income, the share of national income held by the top 10%, is on the rise in Italy, and you can see a little bit more detail about that. And then related, another measure of inequality are concerns about poverty, and that's really where the universal basic income really sort of comes in. And you can see again from this recent report from the World Inequality Database, you can see the share of the population that's considered at risk of poverty across the European countries, and you can see the dramatic rise in concerns about poverty, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe. And so this sort of sets up the important context for what I call the why. So why are we looking for programs like the universal basic income? Is the why concerns about the lack of work? Or is the why a concern about the lack of wages for your work? And the reason why those distinctions are so important is because the type of policy that we advance as a solution may have some concerns if what we're worried about is earnings. So if we think there's never going to be jobs in the future, then maybe we won't be concerned about a social safety net program that discourages work. But if we're primarily concerned about low wages and perhaps insufficient hours of work, then perhaps we want to think about a social safety net that tops up wages rather than discourages work. And so that's really the trade-off that I want to talk about in the rest of my talk. So just to define what I think a universal basic income is as a sort of concept, and to introduce it and then fit underneath that different programs that advanced countries provide, including a program like the Citizens' Income. But let's start with the universal basic income. So I'm going to break up the definition of universal basic income into the three letters, U, B, and I. So the universal part of universal basic income, I think a lot of people use this term without being precise about what universal means. I think the most important feature of universal is that we're offering a social safety net program that is extended to not only people who work, but also people who do not work. Particularly in the US context, where so much of our public benefits are concentrated on those in work, this is a particularly salient characteristic in the US context. So that's one potential dimension of universality. Another dimension of universality is that it's paid to everyone, even those with very high earnings or high incomes. So it is not phased out as your income increases, or perhaps maybe not phased out until your income is, quote, very high, unquote, whatever that might be. Another dimension of universality is that it's extended to all different groups, old and working age, those that are able to work, those are not able to work. So that's a sort of demographic universality. And a pure universal basic income would sort of meet all of those universal features. Though in practice, that is not the case, and they don't meet those features for reasons we'll talk about. Basic, in terms of basic income, is generally meant to mean that the benefit level is high enough to afford a sort of basic standard of living. So it is not a small benefit, but it's a benefit that is meant to perhaps raise incomes to the poverty level, or at least that's the way many people interpret the basic feature. And then the term income is meant to point out that these are benefits that are in cash rather than in kind. And again, in the US context, much of our social safety net is provided in kind, food stamps and other kinds of food benefits as opposed to cash. Housing benefits would be another example of an in-kind benefit. So typically, universal basic income would sort of meet these features. Now, many countries have policies that are in some ways similar to some features of universal basic income, but don't meet all of those features. And so this sort of brings us up to ask the question, what is a universal basic income meant to provide that existing social safety net programs are not already providing? And many people talk about the universal basic income as a substitute, as a replacement for the existing programs that a country might have. Other people talk about a universal basic income as something new to add to an existing set of programs. And these distinctions are extremely important for thinking about, number one, the cost of these programs, and number two, their suitability to target the population who we might be the most concerned about, and that is those with lower incomes. And so, indulge me for just a second on a rather abstract graph, and then we'll transition into more real data. This graph is meant to give you a sort of illustration of all the many ways that government policies can provide income to their constituents. And so the horizontal axis here is a measure of household earnings or income. So the more earnings you have, the farther out on this axis you are. And then the vertical axis gives the benefit amount you would get from the government depending on what your earnings are. And this is a way to this diagram is a way to sort of illustrate all the many ways that we do redistribution through social safety net programs. And let me just point you to a few critical sort of elements of this that will then sort of help guide our discussion later. Element number one, do you get the benefit if you don't work? So if your earnings are zero, does the benefit give you, are you getting benefits from the program? Well, this variable G indicates a guarantee you would get if your earnings are zero. So that's one important element. So in-work benefits like the Earned Income Tax Credit in the United States do not provide any benefits if you don't work. Whereas the guaranteed minimum income or the citizen's income in Italy does provide a guarantee. That's thing one. Thing two is, how much earnings do you have to have before the benefit is phased out? Okay? And the more earnings you have before the benefit is phased out, the more universal it is. the more people it's available to, but the more expensive it is to operate, and the less targeted it is on the most disadvantaged. Element number 3, how quickly do you phase it out if you phase it out? Do you phase it out very gently, or do you phase it out very dramatically? And so the end of this diagram area says, as your earnings increase, how quickly do you lose your benefit? And the reason why we focus on this phase out is because a lot of the work discouragement effect is concentrated by the phase out. So if I'm contemplating entering work and my benefit is phased out as I enter work, that's going to provide on the margin a bit of discouragement of entering work. And it's an empirical question, how much discouragement? And we've got a mountain of research about this high that analyzes many different programs to try to understand the importance of this phase out or tax rate. So we're going to come back to that. So this is now taking that and being a little bit more specific to illustrate the universal basic income. So a pure universal basic income, the red line, would just provide a set benefit to everybody, regardless of their earnings. That would be the pure universal basic income. And I've drawn it to be generous, that is, a high benefit, to reflect the fact that the universal basic income is meant to have this basic income at a relatively high level. Now, one variant of that universal basic income, one that would save us some money, would be to say, okay, well, maybe not everybody should get the universal basic income. We might want to phase it out as your earnings increase. And so we're going to talk about, we'll come back to the issue of the importance of how steeply and at what level of earnings you start to do the phase out, because that turns out to be critical for both cost, targeting, and the extent to which it discourages work. Now, by comparison, I've put on here a typical in-work benefit program, and probably I didn't scale this so well, but this is just an illustration. A typical in-work benefit program says, if you don't work, you get nothing. But as you enter work, we're going to increase your benefit until you get to some maximum amount, and then we'll eventually phase it out. And that's the way by which we think about in-work benefits as topping up your earnings. And what we know from an enormous amount of research on this kind of program in the US and the UK and in other countries is they not only reduce poverty and increase incomes, but they do so while encouraging people to enter the labor force. So they're topping up earnings, reducing poverty, whilst encouraging work on net. In contrast, a typical sort of what we in the United States would call welfare program or cash welfare program, which is similar to the guaranteed minimum income or citizens' income here in Italy, tends to have a relatively low benefit. And again, perhaps I've not drawn this to scale appropriately, but this is just for the purposes of contrast. So if you don't work, you get a benefit, but your benefit is phased out very quickly. And so the benefit tends to be concentrated on those with very low income, and it doesn't really act to top up earnings. It tends to substitute for earnings largely. And so that can be extremely helpful for short-term joblessness, or if we're worried about there never being work in the future and robots taking over the world, then maybe we're not worried about discouraging work. Personally, that's not the world that we're living in now, and so what I want to come to at the end of the talk is to maybe talk about what some policy steps might be for Italy based on these ideas. So let me just show you some very quick calculations from the US context in thinking about a universal basic income in order to motivate the great difficulty that any country would confront with implementing a pure universal basic income. So if you took a universal basic income, as I sort of talked about it earlier, and said that this was going to be a basic income, so we're going to fund it and provide benefits that would be at the level of the poverty line, which in the United States would be about $12,000 per person per year, or $1,000 per month. So if we did that, if we implemented that and made it available to everybody with no phase out, so it's a pure universal program, and we provided it for everybody age 18 and above, that would cost $3 trillion in the United States. How big is that? That's a very big number. That is 3/4 of all federal expenses in the United States. Everything. Defense, Social Security, health insurance, everything. It's very large. It is 2 times the cost of the entire social safety net in the United States as it exists now. It's 6 times the cost of all U.S. social safety net programs that exclude Social Security and exclude health. So while this is a calculation that may not be directly relevant for the context in Italy, this kind of calculation would be a very common one across any developed country. So if you fund something at a true basic income level and provide it for everybody, it very quickly becomes obvious that it's very expensive. That's observation number 1. Observation number 2 is that, okay, well, maybe we can make some changes to the benefit to make it more realistic. So the 2 ways we might do that is, well, why don't we phase it out? Not everybody, Beyonce doesn't need to get the universal basic income. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't need to get the universal basic income. So somewhere we decide to phase it out. But the more we move towards phasing out the universal basic income, the more we move towards a traditional guaranteed minimum income program. It's no longer universal. Maybe the second thing we do to solve the cost problem is that we reduce the benefit level. We don't make it $12,000 per year, we make it $1,000 per year. But then we've lost the basic in the universal basic income. So that's the first observation about the cost. The second observation about the cost is that many people are considering a universal basic income as a replacement for what we're already doing in the social safety net. And it turns out if we do that, it should be obvious by now that you would conclude that if we took away the current social safety net and replaced it with a universal safety net, it's either going to cost a lot more or become much less targeted at the most disadvantaged. Because our current social safety net tends to provide more to the low-income population. If we take the same amount of money and spread it across the entire population, it's going to be less targeted. So what would that look like in the US? This is the amount of benefits that we spend per household in equivalized measures, so accounting for differences in household size, and for different kinds of households. And a very common feature that we see across countries is we spend a lot on households with elderly because of Social Security type programs as well as health programs, although the health programs aren't counted here. We also, in the United States, spend a fair amount on the disabled population, and we spend very little on anybody else. Now, that's the United States. We tend to have much less assistance for the poor compared to other countries. But over here, you can see the spending on households with children on a per capita basis. We could break this down further and again look at these groups, elderly, disabled, with children, and those without children or elderly or disabled, and break them up by 10 deciles of the income distribution. And what you can see is that the benefits for families with children are fairly tilted towards the lower income deciles because we have these in-work benefits, we have these food stamp programs and cash benefits which are phased out. Whereas, interestingly, the programs for the elderly, the Social Security type programs, are much more universal in their structure, which is an interesting kind of observation. And note that the scale of these two graphs are different. This is 6,000 and this is 20,000, just to fit them on the same scale. So the benefits are much larger for the elderly, but the point here is that our current social safety net, and very commonly across industrialized countries, tends to tilt the benefits to the lower income groups. Because after all, that's part of the goal of the social safety net, is to provide protection against adversity in terms of income. So if we take a program that's tilted to the low income and replace it by a universal program, we're going to be taking resources away from the most disadvantaged. So a lesson about the distributional impacts of a universal basic income is it would lead to redistribution from lower earners to higher earners. And it would also lead to redistribution away from groups that now, unless there's some exemption or changes in policies, would move it away from those groups that are currently getting relatively high levels of benefits, if we were to replace our program with a universal basic income program. So this is meant as an illustration of what universal basic income program can do. So let me just kind of talk and sort of set up this issue a little bit more about what I think the core economic issues are in more generally designing a social safety net. And then we can talk about what that means for the Citizens Income Program. And so there's really two important lessons in design of the social safety net that I want to reiterate. And I said earlier, and I want to just say it again. The first one is, when designing a social safety net program, the policymaker is always at a tension between two goals. One goal is protection. My goal for this policy is to protect families and households and individuals from economic shocks, loss of income, loss of earners in the household. That's why they're there. Your income falls and the safety net catches you. But we're also concerned about distortion, typically. That is, we want to provide that protection, but we want to do so in a way that minimizes particularly the discouragement of work. But almost always, the more protection we do, the more distortion there is. And so that's the challenge in designing these programs, is the desire for protection while minimizing the distortion. And so one important thing to think about in the designing of these programs is whether you phase out the benefit gradually. Now, when you do that, the program A costs more, but is creating less distortion, but providing more protection. If you phase it out more steeply, then the program costs less, but is providing a bit less protection and providing more distortion because of this steep phase out. And so the design of the program turns out to be very important for how much it impacts income and to what extent it does so while discouraging work. So that's one lesson. A second lesson has to do with thinking about the in-work benefit as an alternative model for providing protection. So the problem on protection with in-work benefits is it does nothing if you don't work. So it is very ill-suited for protecting against income shocks that take you out of the labor market. But if your concern is more about underemployment and low wages, what an in-work benefit can do is provide benefits to those in work while also encouraging entry into work. Because effectively, this part of the schedule provides a straightforward earnings subsidy. So in the United States, just to be concrete, our earned income tax credit raises your wages by 40%. So if you were a $10 an hour worker, the earned income tax credit effectively raises your hourly wage to $14 per hour by this benefit. And then once your earnings are at a particularly high level, the benefit starts to be phased out. And what we know from this kind of program is it tends to reduce poverty, both because we're giving people money, but also because the process of giving people money leads to more people working, and that also reduces poverty. And some calculations that I've done show that in the United States, the earned income tax credit reduces poverty, and about half of the poverty reduction comes through increases in earnings. The other half comes through the giving out money. Now, there's one important sort of second layer in all of this, and that is, are we applying these programs to a family or an individual? In the United States, we tend to apply these programs to families, and that's important because one potential problem with an in-work benefit lies in the potential secondary worker in the household. So if one worker is already working and the second worker contemplates entering the labor market, most likely they'll be in the phase-out region of the credit. So the earned income tax credit, or most in-work credits, can act as a tax on the second worker in the household. So we can talk about that a little bit more. So let me talk a little bit about citizens' income before we open it up to questions. So what is citizens' income, and how does it fit into this range that we've been talking about? So citizens' income is really most like this sort of program. Not necessarily scaled down this far, but as a program that provides a benefit if you're not working, and very quickly if you enter work, that benefit is reduced. So it's not a universal basic income. It's not a basic income because of the level of the funding. So it's really what we would call in the US a cash welfare program, or what is more generally called a guaranteed minimum income. And that delivers about $500, 500 euros per month with a very steep phase-out rate. And if you read, when I was reading about the new program and looking at some of the articles in the paper and so on, it was described as a basic income program, but I wouldn't think that it meets that definition. But it is an important element of the social safety net that most countries have. So I understand that having a guaranteed minimum income is a relatively new addition to the social safety net in Italy. So by many measures, we would argue that that is a step forward. That is a step forward for providing that protection, which we think is a very important basic element of social safety nets that was not previously available in Italy. But let's be clear that this is really about lowering the poverty gap, and given the funding level, will not do much to lower the rates of poverty. And the fact that it has a very steep phase-out rate means that it is a program that is going to be providing protection, but definitely discouraging work on the margin. Because as your earnings go up, your benefit decreases, and your net gains from work turn out to be very minimal until you jump up to much higher earnings levels. So it's an important plus to say we've added this program to the social safety net in Italy. In addition to rethinking or thinking more about this relatively high phase-out rate, it's clear that the benefit is not adjusted appropriately for differences in family size. So typically, we would set the benefit level in a way that increases with family size to reflect increased needs across different family sizes. And there's a limited adjustment for family size in the citizen's income, which implies a much larger benefit on average to smaller families than it does to larger families. And I understand, compared to the prior program of inclusive income, it has a much stricter requirement for immigrant access to the program to show 10 years of residence continuously in Italy. So going forward, if you were to ask me where I think you should go, this would be my recommendation. Number one, clarify to me anyways, what problem this is meant to be solving. Is it an unemployment problem or is it a low earnings problem? Number two, if one is concerned about the work discouragement, which I take is an issue of concern, the key thing to look at would be the phase-out rate. And obviously, anything you do to make the program less quickly phased out will increase the cost of the program. There's no way around that. So that has to be something that's confronted in the trade-offs. Number three, or perhaps I would put this at the top of the list, is to add a second element to your social safety net program, and that is an in-work-based program rather than the out-of-work-based citizens' income program. So to add a in-work benefit not only provides this work encouragement, but notably it also focuses on increasing formal employment, because in order to get the benefit, you need to have the formality of your work. And I think from a point of fairness, one could argue for adjustments to the citizen's income by family size, and also possibly adjustments for differences in the local cost of living. The benefit is set at the national level, but of course we know the cost of living across different parts of Italy varies quite dramatically. So my own view about stepping back from the European or Italian context to the discussion of universal income more broadly around the world right now, I think this is a good conversation to be having. I've spent my entire career studying the social safety net for the low-income population, trying to understand what works well, what happens when we change policies. I happen to live in a country that dramatically cut back its social safety net in the 1990s and provides very little assistance for people out of work. So having a conversation that says individuals deserve some protection in the state of the world that they can't work, I personally believe is a very good conversation to be having. But I'm very concerned about people looking very far in the future about the loss of jobs and thinking about a truly universal basic income that in my mind would have a lot of advantages, but the disadvantages would mean moving away from a very targeted social safety net to one that is much less targeted. And my concern is the result of that would be to reduce the generosity of the program in order to fund it, which would really be a loss in the protection for the most disadvantaged in our society. So I very much look forward to talking about this in our question and answer.
Great job in giving us also the trade-offs involved in providing social protection, and I think that your slide, the one in providing a recommendation as to the design of the minimum guaranteed income scheme are very important, and we will make sure that the designer of the Reddito di Cittadinanza who will be with us at the festival get them. By the way, some of them are very close to those that we recommended when I was at the Social Security Administration. While you were talking, I made back on the envelope calculation of the cost of a potential UBI, Universal Basic Income Scheme for Italy. Suppose that we put at a level of 500 euros per month, so 6,000 per year, and we target a population of about 50 million, so we just exclude those below the age of 18. It would cost 300 billion euros per year, which is which is about 20% of GDP. Is not it's quite a sizable, more than what you spend every year on pensions. Right, so just to give you the order of magnitude of the thing. So that's one of the reasons why it was not it's not a Reddito di Cittadinanza. The one we have in Italy is something completely different. And the scale of your chart seems to me to be rather appropriate. So there is a quite a size difference. But I'm sure there are a lot of questions here. We start here, so we can have someone to get the microphone. Se possiamo dare il microfono a questo. Grazie.
Thanks. Do we have practical examples of universal basic income schemes which have proved to work well, so have been designed well and have given results also in terms of giving the right incentives to people to work? So is there anywhere in the world where these things have been designed well and have worked? Because it pretty much looks like we have we will end up in a kind of dilemma where it's a bit difficult really to come out and give the right incentives to work.
Very good question. So you want to answer immediately, or will we take?
Okay,
go ahead. Yeah, please. Thank you.
There is no example of a UBI beyond a sort of pilot phase that is truly a UBI. As I said, most countries have something that has benefits that are phased out, but that's not a UBI. There's a lot of pilots that are going on right now, but they are not. They are also, for example, the Y Combinator pilot in the U.S. is targeted in a group that has income below a certain level. The example in Finland is concentrated on a group that's already receiving unemployment insurance. So there are a lot of examples out there, but they tend to be more targeted. But they're universal in the sense that once you're in the group that's eligible, if your earnings change, you continue to get the benefit. So that's the way in which it's a little different from what we're typically doing in the social safety net. And what we know, I recently sort of wrote a paper that sort of reviews what we know from these existing small pilots, as well as the much broader literature that analyzes how these programs affect labor supply. And the key thing that we know is that in the discouragement of work, there are two elements. How high is the benefit, and how quickly is it phased out? And so if we have a program that has a benefit level that's essentially not phased out, there's a level of distortion that's not there. And the evidence is very consistent that the labor supply discouragement is less when you don't have the phase out. So we see that, I mean, we would be shocked by labor supply theory if that were not true, and it is true in every context where we've seen this. But the point, and so that's great, but it comes at a cost, because true universality, you know, as Tito just pointed out, is 20% of GDP. And so that is the conundrum. And I think that where maybe we move forward in that conundrum is that and this is something that for those of us who have studied the social safety net for decades are sort of aware of, is that having programs with steep phase-outs discourage work. And that's in fact why the United States reformed its system in the 90s. In my view, though, we basically just got rid of it as opposed to replacing it with something that was more phased out more modestly.
Good. Another question here.
You started laying out as part of the problem income inequality, and you showed us, among other things, the virtues of the in-work tax credits. I was wondering if there is an issue as well of the income tax credits feeding back into the problem by basically inducing workers to accept lower wages in the long run, or by having lower equilibrium wages at the low end of the wage distribution.
Yeah. I would say that is the biggest unanswered question about in-work credits. And so our basic theory would tell us, you know, just like the theory of taxation tells us that when taxes are imposed, prices change as part of that. And we can't just look at the taxes alone, we need to see how that changes sort of pre-tax prices. The same theory is applied to our thinking about in-work credits. But we have almost no evidence about it. So our theory tells us that could be very important, and some of the existing empirical evidence based on sort of simulations of existing parameter estimates suggests that maybe as much as 40% of the value of the credit could be lost in declining wages. But we really don't know very much. It's a somewhat difficult problem to study because it's a general equilibrium phenomenon, and the earned income tax credit is national in the United States. So it just turns out to be we've been thinking about this problem for a while, and it's very important to raise it. And my own thought is that we're not at the limit of that right now, but we could be, if we were to double or triple the in-work credit. But unfortunately, we don't have many empirical estimates that really guide us on how important it is.
Questions?
In italiano purtroppo.
Benissimo, va benissimo anche in italiano.
Chiedevo in termini comparativi se i suoi studi hanno preso in esame situazioni in altri stati comparabili con quelle adottate in Italia con il reddito di cittadinanza e quali soluzioni a suo avviso coniugano meglio le due grosse incognite che abbiamo, ovvero sostenere la disoccupazione ma al tempo stesso non disincentivare la ricerca di lavoro.
So I primarily study US programs, so I'm not going to be very helpful in giving good comparisons to other countries, but I think now maybe more than 15 OECD countries have in-work benefits as part of their social safety net. And this is something that really has been most enthusiastically adopted by the US and the UK. But there's been a lot of interest in sort of spreading across the OECD in terms of in-work benefits. So this helps joblessness only in so much as the problem of joblessness is low wages. So the in-work credit raises wages that individuals receive and therefore provides more incentive for them to enter work. But it's not going to be a policy that's well suited if, say, there's mismatch between where the population is and where the jobs are. That's obviously not going to be well suited for that feature. But I think the other thing to just think about more broadly is the dramatic lessons that we've learned from every study of these guaranteed minimum income programs across Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and North America. And that is the importance, again, I hate to kind of harp on the same thing, but the importance of at what point the benefit is phased out and how steeply is it phased out. And so those features are the most important for how much work discouragement there is. But I think one of the things that we've been thinking about quite a bit in the US context is whether we should be coupling these benefits with programs that are better suited to help the jobless. And in particular, there's a lot of interest right now in what we're calling sectoral training programs. So that is job training programs that are particularly tied to sectors and employers who are facing skills shortages. And individuals enter these skill programs often with a job sort of ready at the other end of it. And I just saw a very nice broad report by Larry Katz on these programs showing 5 to 10 year rates of return that are quite encouraging. I would say that the training program coupled with the cash benefits is a good combination, in particular for the concern about the joblessness.
Yeah, Ver, please.
Yes. I have an experience in the UK about universal credit. I'm a researcher there, Italian, but emigrated. And it's appalling. It's a disaster. People are obliged and compelled to go to the food banks because they don't have food to eat. It's £317 a month, and the government is so controlling, you know, so that people can't do anything. The criteria to get it are pretty hard, but you're checked. You're not free to use the money as you like, and then each action you do is controlled by the government in terms of housing benefits, in terms that anytime you can lose that benefit and go back to poverty again. And some people actually have mental illness problems because of this situation. So it's proving to be very, very, well, not solving the problem, basically. And even community benefits, which have been introduced in the UK, not in Italy yet. Let's see what happens. But as well, they don't take in consideration the context where these are implemented. I mean, I was curious because a well-designed, I mean, probably policy need to be well-designed, but then what is the impact on people receiving, and do they work?
Yes, thank you. So there's another use of the term universal, which is again a different usage. So the UK has introduced something called the universal credit, which is not universal in the sense of how I've been talking about it. Instead, what it means in that context is we're replacing all these existing programs and replacing it with one program called the universal credit. And essentially, it seems very clear that this is a way to just reduce the welfare state. And that's what it is. It's a reduction in generosity that's very clear, and an increase in the effort that is required to get the benefits. And what you were saying made me think about a couple of things that I didn't say in my remarks that I think are important about universality. And I think it speaks maybe to where you were going with your question. I think one long-standing concern about programs that are very targeted and that have a lot of administrative hassles that you need to work through to get the benefits is they tend to be very stigmatizing. And that individuals, therefore, do not universally take up the benefits because they might feel shame or and there's a lot of sort of transactional costs engaged in getting the benefits. And I think it's very clear, a lot of people talk about one of the benefits of universal basic income is that we're all in this. So universal pension programs aren't stigmatized, everybody gets them, even though there's some redistribution that goes on in them. And so one of the potential benefits of a truly universal program could be that it very much moves us away, at least from the standpoint of where I sit in the United States, and I think also increasingly in the UK, in a world where the people getting the programs don't feel good about it, but they need the benefits, and so they're engaged in trying to attain the benefits. And that's not really a first best outcome. And there's a big movement, there's some really interesting and important scientific work coming out right now that seems to show that when the programs have the greatest administrative costs, and we've learned this through some interesting recent randomized controlled trials and other evidence, it seems to show that the most disadvantaged end up not getting the benefits. So there's a lot of interesting work around what people are calling bandwidth poverty, or the cognitive load of being poor. And what that seems to lead to is the programs that require you to go to the office, wait for the appointment, make your appointment, do the forms, come back 3 months later, do the forms again, have your meeting, call up, check on your work status, that the people who end up dropping out of the system tend to be those who are the most vulnerable. And so there's a lot of interest right now in the US context in trying to do more automation of these benefits to reduce the transaction costs in order to make them available more broadly to those that are eligible, and in the hopes that that would also sort of reduce some of the stigma of the programs. There's not been much change yet, but there's a lot of discussion about it in the policy world.
While we wait for other people to ask a question, and so far they've been all very good, I have to say, let me say that Hilari just made a very important point. That is, you don't need to make sometimes a decision among alternative instruments, like, for instance, a minimum guaranteed income or an employment conditional incentives. Minimum guaranteed income protecting mainly the unemployed people, and the other, fighting against poverty among workers and incentivizing to work, provided that you have clearly funds. If you have properly integrated minimum guaranteed income, may well coexist with an employment conditional incentive. The issue is to design them properly so that they work well together. And sometimes when people say we have to choose, they just want to downscale programs to fight against poverty. So let's see if there are more questions here. Yes, one there.
In Italian, please. Yeah.
In Italian is fine. Perfetto. Prego.
Ho sentito spesso due obiezioni rispetto al reddito di cittadinanza, una più ideologica, secondo cui scoraggerebbe comunque l'etica del lavoro. Qualcuno la può trovare anacronistica, ma è un'obiezione che si sente spesso. La seconda, più pratica, riguarda invece le spinte inflazionistiche che comporterebbe una misura del genere. Come risponde a queste due obiezioni?
I didn't get the first one. Was it about what?
Ideology, but I think
Okay. Okay. So the impacts on inflation is something that has been looked at a little bit in the US context, and I don't think that there's much evidence to be concerned about that. Now, of course, it partly depends on, would very much importantly depend on how big this is, how many people are affected by it, how much, 20% of GDP versus what is the current citizen's income is like.
the cost.
Yeah, currently it's like point.
5 billion.
Right, exactly. So quite small. So I don't think that that's a first order concern about inflation. I think the real concern that you raise about the ideological concern is one that really comes down to taste for redistribution and concerns about how much protection needs to be provided. And I take it there's also a lot of issues that play out in the context of this policy that have a regional dimension to them. And I'm familiar with those kinds of discussions because the regional discussions come up in the US context as well. And I think part of this, again, comes back to the issue about, I know that very true in the US context, and I imagine would be true in Italy as well, if you were to ask, give an opinion survey to get information about the public's interest in redistribution, you tend to get very different responses when you phrase a question around if we have a program that increases income while helping people help themselves, you tend to get a lot more support for the program than one that is a purely, out of work benefit for an indeterminate period of time. And so I think that that's where you need to try to find the balance between having a more time-limited guaranteed minimum income in combination with putting more resources into in-work benefits. I think let me put it this way. The ideological debates in the United States, the earned income tax credit, our in-work credit, have been increased in generosity as many times under Republican administrations as it has among Democratic administrations. And it's sort of the only element of the social safety net program that is somewhat bipartisan. And I think that it comes from this idea of wanting to do support, but wanting to do support when individuals are contributing to that. And while that can't be our only element of the social safety net, in my opinion, because we need to provide some protection out of work, as Tito was saying before, we need to figure out how to put these things together in order to provide a more holistic package. So I guess that's my thoughts on those two important questions.
Another question from Philip from Paris, who has been studying very much UBI schemes. So if you can get a microphone here. Possiamo dare il microfono qua, per cortesia? Dove è finito? Qua. Qua. Se fa il giro di qua, per cortesia. Qui, questo da questa parte.
No, this was very interesting. Before, when you described things, you said people deserve, I quote, deserve to get certain benefits. And there's really a tension, the way I see it, in the way people in the United States consider things, because people on the conservative say, believe more that people who are poor, but they are deserving poor, well, then they should be helped, but not the others, definitely. On the other hand, people more on the liberal or left direction take the view that if people are poor, it's really somewhere part of the system that caused them to become poor, and therefore they don't have to individually show anything if they grew up in a rotten area and they got poor teachers, and then they are out of work, they don't have any skills. It's not their fault, it's our fault, the system's fault, and so forth. And in terms of support then for policies, I imagine this would really play out very strongly. So just any thought about that?
Yeah, let me pick up on one thing that you said about the deserve piece, and it gives me a little bit of an opening to talk a little bit about some work that I and others have been doing that I think might find a third road here. And so one way that might be important to add to the conversation is there's a growing set of studies that shows quite clearly that low income when children are young has long-term effects of where they end up in adulthood. And while we've kind of known about this in a correlational sense for a long time, there's this new wave of research, a lot of it done by looking at the social safety net. So for example, I have several studies that look at the beginnings of the food stamp program in the United States now 50 years ago, and use some very Alan Krueger-esque, if I might say, quasi-experimental variation in the beginnings of this program to basically ask people who are now in their 50s, where we have some kind of experimental variation about how much access to the social safety net program they had in early life. What this research shows is that providing more protection when children are young, particularly less than age 5, leads to dramatic improvements in their human capital and health in adulthood. And so another way to think about this might be to take the word deserving away. That's sort of a position of just taste for redistribution. But instead say there's actually public benefits to providing protection. And it's interesting because I woke up one day and this light bulb went off in my head when I realized that when we talk about investments in early life human capital, like early childhood education, the theoretical discussion is always, this program is going to cost something today, but it's going to yield benefits in the long run. But we never talk about the social safety net that way. We talk about the social safety net, as I did today, as a current solution to a current poverty problem. With this new wave of research that has really only come online in the last 5 to 10 years, we see time after time evidence that providing more protection when at least with respect to looking at effects on children, leads to improvements in their graduating high school, going to college. In the United States, some evidence that they're less likely to engage in crime in adulthood. And so there's a way in which we can say that providing more protection through traditional guaranteed minimum income programs might cost us something today, but could yield both private as well as public benefits in the longer run. Do these programs pay for themselves that way? Maybe not, but we're just starting to quantify the magnitude of those benefits. And I think that it's something that just hasn't been part of the conversation. So it's my hope that that could be something that could add to your quite appropriate description of the sort of two views on the whole enterprise of social safety net protection. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Hilari. I think the time is getting really short. Devo dire, innanzitutto, no, grazie mille. Credo che ci siano molte altre domande che noi vorremmo porre, vedo delle persone anche su Retro che domandavano di poter parlare, ma avremo altre occasioni qui al Festival per discutere, a partire dalla lezione di Filippo Pairis domani alle 18:30 a Palazzo Geremia, e poi in futura edizione del Festival, perché bisogna raccogliere i dati e fare ricerca anche sperimentale su questi aspetti, come Alan Krueger ci ha insegnato. Voglio ringraziare il pubblico per le domande molto ricche e interessanti che ha fatto, e ringraziare in anticipo coloro che hanno, gli economisti che ci hanno già dato la disponibilità per tenere le prossime Alan Krueger Lecture. Li ripeto: Josh Angrist, David Card, Larry Katz ed Enrico Moretti, che appunto nelle prossime edizioni del Festival manterranno vivo il ricordo del grande contributo che Alan Krueger ha dato al pensiero economico e alla ricerca applicata sui temi redistributivi. Grazie a tutti.